them. Kiprono Kittony is the current chairperson of the National Chamber for Industry and Commerce. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. Mrs. Biwott, the entire Biwott family, retired President Kikwete, distinguished dignitaries and fellow mourners. On behalf of the entire business community in Kenya, I stand before you to extend our sincere condolence at the demise of a true giant in the business community. Nicholas Biwott, I think, can be said to have succeeded in almost everything that he did. Very rarely do we speak of a person who was not just a great public servant, a great politician, but also a great businessman. We've read in his eulogy of the enterprise, and the man's industry was truly legendary. The things that he did from the very beginning to the very end speak for themselves and have provided employment to thousands of Kenyans and also contributed immensely to the economy of this country. It is true to say that he was a real giant. Nicholas Biwott went to school with my father. They were classmates in Kapsabet in 1953. And my father told me many stories about him. He said, firstly, that in Kapsabet, nobody ever took the first place in class. That was the preserve of Nicholas Biwott. And I think that was the beginning of many firsts in his life. And where my father and Bartonio Rotich and others later on excelled in sporting and represented Kenya in the East African Games in 1957, Honorable Biwott made a good account of himself academically. And when my father passed on in 2007, in his true style, Mr. Biwott came late in his helicopter, and when he stood by my father's grave, he touched me on the back, and he said, "Don't worry, I'm there for you." And last year, when I was contesting for the chamber elections, he actually went and mobilized delegates for me, physically himself. He would invite them to the Serena, and he'd do so many things for them. And he never asked a favor. One day, when the Prime Minister Netanyahu was here, he called me and said, "Can you kindly see that I get a good place to sit in the forum?" And of course, being who he was, he came into the room with Mrs. Biwott, and they sat at the front. And I was really glad to see that he was recognized by the government, the CS Amina, the president. They called him forward, and he wanted that night and said, "Thank you very much." Honorable Biwott has made a huge contribution in this country, an immense contribution. In business, he executed his moves with precision, with deftness, and with stealth. He was like a grandmaster in a game of chess, because he would only, at the end of it, see the result of his enterprise and his industry. So he's a man that I shall miss personally, because he stood by me, and I really loved and respected Honorable Biwott. And I think in the fullness of time, history will be written, and there will be amends made where people said the wrong things about him. And for me, I think as Kenyans, the most befitting tribute that we could make to Honorable Biwott is to have a peaceful election, is to respect the government that will be elected, the government of the day, because he always stood and respected the government. Now, I'll just give you a short story. Sometime in the late 90s, and Charles Field Marsham is here, when they were expanding into Uganda, a good friend of ours, Honorable Kutesa, assisted in that. And later on, Honorable Kutesa called me and asked that I arrange an appointment with Mr. Biwott. I called Charles, and he said yes, asked him to come. And I went to the airport and picked Honorable Kutesa, and I told Honorable Kutesa on our way from the airport that Mr. Biwott's meetings are not always conventional. So we went into town and had lunch in a Chinese restaurant. And at about 1:30, Charles called and said, "Come to Harambee House now." And I drove to Harambee House with Sam Kutesa. And when we got there, I met Charles standing with his father-in-law. And the meeting was held on the stones in the parking lot in Harambee House. And the meeting, as usual, did not last more than 5 minutes. So we will miss Honorable Biwott. He's a truly, and to quote Shakespeare, he bestrode this narrow world like a colossus. May he rest in eternal peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kiprono.